The storm came down off the Cascades like something angry. 43 of the best combat shooters in the country stood on that frozen range. Rifles worth more than most people's cars. Reputations built on classified operations across 3 continents. Then a beat-up Tacoma pulled into the lot, and a woman climbed out carrying a rifle case held together with electrical tape. The laughter started before she reached the registration table. Colonel Marcus Kane looked at her the way men like him looked at everything that didn't fit, with the particular contempt of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. He was about to become very, very wrong. If this story is already pulling you in, hit follow, drop a like, and tell me what city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this thing travels. The Harker Mountain Range in early February was not a place that forgave mistakes. The elevation sat at just over 9,000 feet, and the valley where the Cascades Precision Marksmanship Invitational had been held for the past 11 years was a natural wind tunnel, a long corridor of granite and Douglas fir that funneled weather down from the northern peaks with the consistency of a machine. Temperatures at the range floor routinely dropped below zero by mid-morning. The light came in flat and pale, the kind of light that flattened distances and tricked rangefinders. Snow didn't fall here so much as move sideways. Soldiers called it the kind of place that separated people from their assumptions. The base itself, Forward Operating Station Harker, was a working installation, not a showpiece. The buildings were prefab metal structures anchored into the permafrost with rebar and concrete pads, the kind of construction that was meant to be functional and nothing else. The range complex had been expanded 3 times over the past decade, and you could read the history of that expansion in the way the structures didn't quite match. Newer aluminum panels bolted alongside older corrugated steel, fresh gravel walkways that ended abruptly at older packed dirt paths worn smooth by years of boots. The Invitational had been running here since the installation commander at the time, a 2-star general with a particular obsession with long-range precision doctrine, had decided that the military's best shooters needed a venue that would actually test them. Not a comfortable, controlled range with ideal conditions and padded shooting benches. Something real. Something that would show who was actually good and who had just been lucky in favorable conditions. Over the years, the event had grown. What started as an informal gathering of special operations shooters had expanded into something the various services watched closely, even if nobody admitted it publicly. The competitors were drawn from every branch: Marine Raiders, Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Air Force combat controllers, and a handful of contractors who operated in the gray spaces between those categories. 43 shooters this year, the highest number in the event's history. Registration began at 0700 on a Tuesday morning, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline, thin and cold, doing very little actual warming, most competitors had already checked in, collected their range packets, and begun the process of studying the event overview. Elena Cross arrived at 0742. She drove a 2009 Tacoma, the kind that had been worked hard for 16 years and showed every one of them. The passenger door had a crease along the lower panel that had never been repaired, just primed and left. One of the rear windows had a 1/4-inch crack sealed with a strip of clear packing tape. The bed held 2 large duffel bags, a hard-sided case for her spotting equipment, and a rifle case that was, objectively speaking, the least impressive piece of luggage in the parking lot. The case itself was a mid-tier Pelican knockoff, the kind that had started life with a decent foam interior and been relined so many times the original padding was just a memory. The latches had been replaced at least once. The new ones were slightly larger than the original fittings and left small gaps that had been filled with black electrical tape. The case was functional. It was also, next to the machined aluminum customs and Pelican 1750 longs that surrounded it, visually striking in all the wrong ways. Elena lifted it out of the truck bed without ceremony and set it on the gravel. She was 34 years old, though she looked younger in poor light and older when she was concentrating on something. Medium height, the kind of lean that came from years of physical work rather than a gym program. Her hair was dark brown and cut short, practical rather than stylish, and she wore it under a wool watch cap that had been washed enough times. The original color was a matter of interpretation. Her cold weather gear was standard military issue, nothing custom, nothing modified, no unit patches or brand insignia. Her face was the kind of face that didn't give you much if you weren't paying close attention. She was not, in any conventional sense, an impressive first impression. The man at the registration table, a young staff sergeant named Kowalski, who was technically assigned to logistics for the event, looked up from his clipboard and paused for a fraction of a second too long. "Name?" he said. "Cross, Elena, Captain." He found her on the list, checked the box, and handed over the range packet with the specific kind of blank efficiency of someone doing math in their head that they weren't going to say out loud. She took the packet, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the shooter staging area. The staging area was a covered structure at the back of the parking lot. 3 walls and a roof, open on the eastern face, lined with long steel workbenches and electrical outlets for equipment charging. About 30 competitors were there when Elena arrived, in various stages of equipment prep, cleaning rods and bore snakes, rangefinders being zeroed, spotting scopes mounted on tripods at the open end pointed at the main range complex. The conversation was loud and easy. This was a community that knew itself. People were trading call signs and deployments the way civilians traded hometowns. There were handshakes and shoulder grabs, and the kind of shorthand communication that took years of shared context to develop. Elena found a spot at the far end of the left bench and began unpacking. She did it quietly and systematically. Rifle case on the bench, latches unclipped, spotting case beside it. Both duffels on the floor, the larger one opened first. She worked from left to right with the specific economy of motion of someone who had done this in conditions where rushing meant errors and errors had consequences. The rifle came out of the case in 2 pieces, barrel assembly and receiver, and she began a methodical inspection that had nothing theatrical about it. Function check, chamber inspection. She had a small LED penlight she used to look down the bore, holding it up to the light at the bench's overhead strip before swapping to the light. The scope went on next. A quality glass, several years old, the kind that had been through enough use that the finish on the turret caps was worn, but the internals were still precise. The man to her immediate right was a Marine Raider sergeant named Decker, who had, by his own later account, been watching her without quite meaning to. He was a tall, solid man who'd been doing this kind of work for 11 years, and prided himself on reading people fast. What he saw didn't compute. The rifle was a military spec precision rifle, production model, not custom. Good rifle. A workhorse. Not the kind of thing the top-ranked competitors typically brought to events like this, where the custom shop long guns were as much a statement as a tool. She had a standard-issue bipod. Her ammunition was in a generic military spec container, marked with lot number and date, but nothing else. No custom hand loads, no specialized ammunition packaging that would indicate a boutique load. Her kit was clean, competent, and completely unremarkable. Decker almost said something and then didn't, which he would later think about more than once. The man who did say something was standing 15 feet away. Oh. Colonel Marcus Kane had arrived early enough to claim the best bench position, center right, closest to the range exit, which was a habit he'd developed at a dozen events like this one. He was 41, with the build of someone who had been genuinely athletic in his 30s and still maintained enough of it to look the part, though the maintenance now required considerably more effort than it once had. His hair was cut with precision. His gear was exceptional. A custom shop rifle that had cost more than most people spent on a car. A spotting scope with glass so clear it was almost unsettling. Ammunition loaded to tolerances that required a dedicated ballistics program to specify. He'd won the Harker Invitational twice, placed in the top 5 4 additional times. He had a way of moving through a staging area that said he understood the geography, knew where to be, where to stand, how to fill space in a way that made other people work around him rather than the reverse. He wasn't cruel. That was the thing about Kane that made him genuinely complicated. He wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. He was the kind of person who had been good at something for long enough that the goodness had become a framework through which he evaluated everything else. He didn't think of himself as someone who looked down on people. He thought of himself as someone who understood the difference between serious competitors and everyone else. He spotted Elena's rifle case from 20 feet away. He said something to the man beside him, a special forces captain named Okafor. And whatever it was, Okafor's expression shifted in the way that expressions shift when something has been said that's slightly too true to laugh at and slightly too unkind to endorse. Kane crossed the staging area with the specific confidence of a man who believed he was about to be helpful. "That a factory barrel?" he said. Elena looked up from her inspection. "Yeah." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not really agreeing so much as waiting for their next sentence to be ready. "Which lot?" she told him. Another nod. He glanced at the rifle with the expression of a mechanic looking at a car that was going to need work. "You run that load before?" "Yes." "At elevation?" "Yes." He waited, apparently expecting more. When more didn't come, he said, "The wind here is unusual. The valley effect creates significant variable drift that changes by range sector. Most people's DOPE from lower altitude ranges doesn't transfer cleanly. If you're working off established data, you'll want to build in some adjustment time." "Thanks." He looked at her for a moment. Not unkindly. Just with the particular patience of someone who has decided they're dealing with a person who doesn't fully understand the situation. "Have you shot here before?" "No." He nodded again, satisfied with something. "The last event, we had a couple of competitors who came in with standard issue setups." He paused. "They didn't make the second day." Elena looked at him. Her expression didn't change. "Good to know," she said. She turned back to her rifle. Kane stood there for an extra second, just long enough for it to be noticeable, and then walked back to his side of the staging area. The morning orientation took place in the installation's main briefing room, a prefab structure with drop ceilings and fluorescent lighting and a projection screen that had a dead spot in the lower left corner. The event's range officer, a retired Ranger Battalion commander named Wilkes, who ran these proceedings like he ran everything else, with a minimum of decoration and a maximum of information, walked through the event structure in under 20 minutes, 4 stages over 2 days. The first 3 stages were conventional long-range precision challenges: distance, positional shooting, unknown distance problem solving. The 4th stage was Ice Fang. Wilkes described it briefly and didn't oversell it. 7 targets, extended distances, active environmental conditions, 1 45-minute window per competitor. Scoring was simple. Hits counted, misses didn't. The competitor who hit the most targets in the fastest combined time across all 4 stages won. The room asked questions. Kane asked 2 of them, both specific, both technical, both the kind of questions that demonstrated familiarity with the event structure. He got answers and wrote them in a small notebook. Elena didn't ask questions. The man to her left, a Navy SEAL chief named Bautista, who would later describe this particular moment in considerable detail, noticed that she was watching Wilkes with the specific focused attention of someone who was processing, not just listening. She didn't take notes. She didn't shift in her chair. She just watched. Bautista had been doing this for 14 years. He'd developed, by necessity, a specific ability to read people in high-pressure environments, to understand from the outside who was managing their nerves and who was actually calm. The difference was subtle and almost impossible to fake once you knew what to look for. He couldn't tell which one she was. That bothered him more than he expected. Stage 1 ran in the afternoon, after lunch, after equipment inspections were completed and the range safety briefing had been delivered twice. It was a 5-position course, 5 shooting stations at increasing ranges, starting at 600 meters and ending at 1,400. Standard bipod shooting at the closer positions, improvised supports at the longer ranges. The wind had picked up by the time the first relay started, coming down the valley in irregular bursts that made calculations complicated. Kane went in the 3rd relay and put up the kind of score that justified his reputation. Smooth, deliberate, efficient. He didn't rush and he didn't waste shots. His spotter, a contractor named Villegas, whom he'd worked with for 3 years, gave him corrections in the flat, specific language of someone who trusted their equipment and had good reason to. They worked together the way well-calibrated machines work together. He walked off the stage with a 94 out of 100 and a small, particular smile. Elena was in the 5th relay. She went out with a government-issue spotting scope mounted on a standard tripod, no dedicated spotter, and took her time setting up at each position in a way that a few observers found almost puzzling in its deliberateness. Not slow. That wasn't the right word. She wasn't slow. She just didn't appear to be in any hurry, which in a timed event felt different. What she did at each position, for anyone watching closely enough, was spend the first 30 to 40 seconds doing nothing that looked like shooting preparation. She watched. Wind direction, wind speed, how the Mirage was moving above the ground cover between her and the targets, what the spotting scope showed about the thermal layers. She had a small handheld anemometer, but she mostly seemed to use it as a check against what she was already seeing rather than as a primary data source. Then she shot. She went 7 for 10 on stage 1. Score of 85. Not bad. Not good enough to draw attention in any direction. She was in the middle of the pack, which was exactly where someone with her equipment should statistically have been, and the few people who were watching her for specific reasons, and at this point there were only a few, had nothing in particular to go on. Kane's 94 was the top score for the day. He knew it, and the way he accepted the congratulations of the people around him was gracious in the specific way that people are gracious when they're completely comfortable with the fact that they deserve what they're receiving. In the staging area afterward, clearing and casing their rifles, Okafor came up behind Kane and gestured with his chin toward where Elena was working. "She shot an 85, Okafor said. That's middle of the pack. That's what I expected," Kane said. "The equipment does what it does." Okafor said nothing. "Some people," Kane said, methodically wiping down his barrel, "come to events like this because they want the experience. That's legitimate. Not everyone is here to compete for the same thing." He meant it as a generous interpretation, the particular generosity of someone who didn't see why it would come across any other way. The second day opened cold and clearer than expected. Stage 2 was a positional nightmare, shooting from elevated platforms, vehicle simulators, around barricades, in conditions that meant your body was never in a comfortable relationship with your rifle. It tested the kind of fundamentals that looked invisible when they were working and catastrophic when they weren't. It was the kind of stage where technique that had been trained under stress held up, and technique that had only been trained in comfortable conditions fell apart in specific, identifiable ways. Elena shot stage 2 in the second relay. She hit 10 of 10. Perfect score. She stepped off the stage and walked back to the staging area and began her post-stage maintenance routine, and there was a moment, brief, specific, where the radio traffic between the range spotters and the main scoring table stopped for about 4 seconds, which was the amount of time it took for someone to verify what they'd just heard before they repeated it. Decker heard the score from the spotter next to him and said quietly, "Say again." The spotter looked at his tablet. 10 for 10. Perfect. Decker looked at the staging area. Kane had also heard it. His expression was carefully neutral in the way expressions are carefully neutral when someone is actively working on making them that way. "Wind dropped," Villegas said, matter-of-factly. "Wind dropped for everyone," Kane said. "She was in the second relay. Same conditions as the 4th and 6th. Nobody responded. Stage 3, the unknown distance problem, ran in the afternoon and into the early evening, finished under artificial lighting at the far end of the range, where temporary floodlights had been rigged on poles that swayed slightly in the freshening wind. Unknown distance stages were less about physical shooting skill and more about the complete integration of shooting, ranging, and environmental problem solving. No target distances were given. Competitors had to determine range themselves, calculate their firing solution on the fly, and apply it under time pressure. The targets were different sizes at different positions, which meant that apparent size was a deceptive indicator, and you had to actually do the math. Elena spent the first 12 of her 40-minute window doing what looked, from the observation post, like nothing. She was building her range card. Methodically, without notes, she kept it in her head. She worked through the visible terrain features, cross-referenced them with the topographic information she'd spent the previous evening committing to memory from the event materials, and used the relationships between landmarks to triangulate target positions. Then she shot. She missed twice. Both times on the same target, a 12-inch plate at 1,140 meters that was positioned in a way that made the wind effect unpredictable. After the second miss, she stopped, reassessed, made a small mechanical adjustment, and put the third shot through. Efficiency. Not elegance. Not the smooth, flowing performance that the best shooters sometimes delivered when everything was working. This was grinding, deliberate competence, the kind that knew when something wasn't working and changed it, rather than applying more of the same. Final score for Stage 3, 88 out of 100. Combined two-day score going into Icefang, Elena sat in fourth place overall. The top three were Kane at 287, a Marine Raider Master Sergeant named Hutchins at 281, and an Air Force Special Tactics officer named De Silva at 276. Elena was at 273. Statistically, Icefang could change the order. The scoring differential meant anyone in the top 10 could theoretically finish first if they did very well on the final stage. It was the specific design of the event. Nothing was decided until the end. Wilkes announced the final stage order that evening at the briefing. The top four scorers would shoot last, in reverse order. Elena would shoot second to last. Kane would shoot last. That night, in the installation's common room, over coffee that had been sitting in the urn long enough to have become something closer to a moral position than a beverage, the conversation around the event's third day happened in the way these conversations always happened. Loose, honest, in the way only tired people are honest, circling around the thing everyone was actually thinking. Fourth place, Decker said to Bautista. He wasn't asking a question. Fourth place, Bautista confirmed. With that rifle. Bautista turned his coffee mug in his hands. With that rifle. Decker had shot with people from a lot of different backgrounds over 14 years. He had a specific ability to read the difference between someone who had good mechanics and someone who had operational experience, the particular quality of someone for whom shooting had never been an end in itself, but a tool in a context with actual stakes. Elena's shooting had that quality. He didn't say this to Bautista. He just sat with it. Across the common room, Kane was talking to a small group, 3 or 4 people, all of whom were clearly engaged. He was good at this part of competition, the management of the social environment. He knew when to be generous and when to be competitive, and he developed an instinct for how the two worked together. His read on the final stage was specific and delivered with the authority of someone who had won this event twice. Icefang is the great equalizer, he was saying, because it removes equipment variability. At those distances, the differences in glass and ammunition start to matter less than the differences in the shooters. You're working at the edge of what's physically achievable. Someone asked about Elena. Kane paused. The pause was short, but it was there. She's done better than I expected, he said. This was genuine. Fourth place going in, that's real. The stage 2 score was impressive. Another pause. The final stage will be a different conversation. He believed this. That was the thing. He wasn't posturing. He genuinely believed that Icefang, at those ranges, with those conditions, would create a result consistent with what the equipment and the observable skill level suggested. He'd been right about this kind of thing before. Icefang ran in the morning. The valley was doing what the valley did, funneling wind from the northwest at irregular speeds with gusts that hit the range sector in waves rather than steadily, which meant the standard correction approach of holding for average conditions didn't work cleanly. You had to read the gusts. You had to anticipate. The observation post for Icefang was elevated, a purpose-built platform on the eastern ridge that gave spotters and observers a sightline across all 7 target positions. Most of the remaining competitors who weren't actively shooting had made their way up there before the stage began. The first 20 competitors to shoot produced a scoring distribution that told you everything about how hard Icefang actually was. The median score was 4 hits. The top score through the first 20 competitors was 6 hits, posted by Da Silva, who had run a technically precise stage with his military spec rifle and his spotter, a taciturn ranger sergeant named Platt, and had spent 42 of his 45 minutes in the lane. Nobody had cleared Icefang completely in 5 years of the stage's existence. Hutchins shot 5th from last and put up 5 hits, clean, fast, with the kind of precision that explained how he'd gotten to where he was, but the 7th target stopped him. He took 3 shots at it, watched 2 miss, and called time himself rather than burning the clock. Kane went 4th from last. He went to the line the way he always went to the line. Deliberate, composed, with the specific internal quiet of someone who had been here before and knew how to use that. Villegas set up the spotting scope without a word. They had a shorthand that was almost wordless by now, built over 3 years of working together. He hit the first 3 targets in the first 8 minutes. Good, efficient, well calculated. Target 4 gave him trouble. A brief wind change that he calculated incorrectly cost him a shot, and 90 seconds of reassessment. He hit it on the second attempt. 5 and 6 went cleanly. He had 11 minutes left when he moved to target 7. Target 7 was the stage's signature. At a distance that strained the envelope of what was technically possible with precision rifle fire under adverse conditions, positioned in a wind shadow that created unpredictable terminal trajectory behavior, it was the shot that separated the event's mythology from its results. Da Silva's 6 hits had been earned. Kane's 6 hits, when they came, would be earned too. He spent 4 minutes on his firing solution. Villegas gave him wind, gave him correction, and Kane worked through the problem with the specific patience of someone who understood that rushing was how you turned a difficult shot into an impossible one. He fired. The shot tracked. Then the wind shifted. It was a small shift, 3 to 4 miles per hour, a change in the gust pattern that moved through the valley floor faster than the spotters on the ridge could call it. The bullet hit the target stand 6 inches low and left of center. Miss? Kane adjusted. Took the time. 7 minutes left. He fired again. The wind shifted again. Same direction, slightly more pronounced. Miss. 5 minutes. He made a calculation. He ran through the wind call a second time, cross-referenced against the mirage pattern he'd been watching, made a correction he wasn't entirely certain about. Time expired. 6 hits. Same as Da Silva. Kane cleared the lane with his face showing nothing. He was a professional in the fullest sense. He didn't display what he felt publicly, and what he felt was the specific, complicated frustration of someone who had done almost everything right and been defeated by a variable he couldn't fully control. He handed his rifle to Villegas, and Villegas took it without comment. But Elena Cross went to the line. The observation platform had 41 people on it. The conversation up there had quieted when she walked to the lane, not dramatically, just in the way that conversations quiet when something is about to happen that people aren't sure how to categorize. She shot without a spotter. She'd done the walk of the target positions herself the previous evening, using the course map and a rangefinder she borrowed from the staging area, and she'd built her own range card from scratch, working from terrain features and sight lines rather than from the official target distances that the event provided. The official distances were accurate. She trusted them. But she wanted her own picture of the problem. She had a method for windy ranges that she'd developed over years of work in conditions that were not, technically speaking, conducive to long-range precision, a way of reading the valley floor's wind indicators at multiple distances simultaneously and using the pattern to anticipate rather than react. It was imperfect. It worked better than reacting, which was itself imperfect. She started the clock. Targets 1 through 3 went in 13 minutes. Not fast. Methodical. A word that didn't capture it exactly because there was nothing mechanical about it. Each shot preceded by a specific pause that the observers on the platform began to learn to anticipate. She would settle, she would still completely, and then at some point in that stillness, there would be a moment that felt like a decision being made, and then the rifle would fire. Target 4. She studied it for longer than the previous 3. 3 minutes of observation before she fired. Miss? She watched where the shot went, made an adjustment that was visible only as a small movement of her hand at the turret, and fired again. Hit. 5 went in 2 shots. 6 went in 1. 31 minutes gone. 14 minutes left. She was at 6 hits, same as Da Silva. Same as Kane. The observation platform was quiet in the way things get quiet when people have been holding their breath without fully realizing it. Target 7. At the distance it sat, a distance that the event materials listed with the specific confidence of a number that everyone knew was technically achievable and practically brutal. The target was a dark rectangle against the pale granite of the far ridgeline. Small. Through a standard scope at maximum magnification, it looked like something you could cover with your thumbnail. Elena looked at it for a long time, not because she was nervous. The observers who later tried to articulate what her stillness felt like consistently failed to find the right word, because nervous was completely wrong, and calm didn't capture it either, and focused was accurate but felt insufficient. She was doing something in those minutes that looked, from the outside, like nothing, and was actually the most complicated thing on the range. She was reading the valley, not the wind at her position. The wind across the entire 1,200-meter corridor between her muzzle and that target. The way the Mirage moved above the ground cover at 500 meters. The way the flag at the 600-meter marker was tracking versus where it had been tracking 4 minutes ago. The behavior of the loose snow above the target face, which told her something about the terminal wind environment that no spotter could call fast enough to be useful. She was building a picture. 9 minutes left. She settled. The stillness came. On the observation platform, Decker realized he was leaning forward, both hands on the railing, and didn't remember when that had started. The rifle fired. The sound traveled across the valley and then came back as a faint echo off the far granite. For 4 seconds, nobody on the observation platform made any noise at all. Then the radio crackled. The spotter at Target 7, a young specialist named Torres, who had been sitting at that position for 3 hours in 23-degree weather and had watched 12 competitors attempt and fail that shot, said 3 words in a voice that was entirely flat, with the specific flatness of someone whose job is to be objective and who is working very hard at that right now. Target 7, hit. And then quieter, almost to himself, almost not on the radio at all. Dead center. The observation platform didn't erupt. It didn't burst into applause, or noise, or celebration. It went the other direction. 41 people, most of whom had spent careers in environments where the appropriate response to extraordinary things was controlled stillness, stood on that elevated platform in the February cold and said almost nothing. Bautista exhaled slowly through his nose. He'd been holding a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Decker straightened up from the railing. Kane, who was standing to the right of the main observation cluster with Villegas, was looking at the lane. His jaw was set. His hands were still. He was doing the specific difficult work of a person who has just seen something they have to integrate into a picture of the world that had not previously contained it. He'd said the final stage would be a different conversation. He hadn't been wrong. It was. The conversation it turned out to be was just not the one he'd expected. Chump. Elena cleared the lane, ejected the final round, and began the post-stage breakdown with the same systematic quiet she'd applied to everything else since she'd arrived. She didn't look at the observation platform. She didn't look at the scoreboard where Torres was now calling in numbers to the scoring table. She broke down her rifle, wiped the bore, cased both pieces, and began collecting her spotting equipment. She was loading the spotting case when a shadow fell across her workbench. She looked up. A man she didn't recognize was standing 3 feet away, still in his shooting gear, a spotter's kit over one shoulder. He was in his late 40s, with the specific kind of face that had been through weather. Not age exactly, something more specific than age. The particular texture of someone who had spent years in places that were trying to kill him. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the open-mouthed surprise of the people who'd been watching from the platform. Not the careful neutral of Kane. Something else. Recognition. "I'm sorry," she said, because he was still just standing there. "Can I—" "Ghost 1, he said. His voice was quiet, not dramatic, just a fact being stated. Elena's hands stilled on the latches of the spotting case. She looked at him. He held her gaze, and in his eyes was the specific expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just found the place where he's been told to put it down. "My name is Nathan Reed," he said. "Commander, Naval Special Warfare, and I've been looking for you for 7 years." The staging area had gone still again. Somewhere behind her, Elena heard someone's spotting scope tripod hit the gravel because the person holding it had stopped paying attention to it. She looked at Nathan Reed. She looked at the staging area full of people who were looking back at her. And she said nothing. Because Ghost 1 had never been someone who needed to. The staging area held its breath. Nathan Reed stood 3 feet from Elena Cross and said nothing else, because he understood, the way men who had spent years in close-quarters environments learned to understand, that the silence after a statement like that one was not empty. It was full. It was doing work. Elena's hands had gone still on the latches of the spotting case. She didn't move them. She looked at Nathan with the specific kind of assessment that wasn't hostile and wasn't warm and wasn't anything easily readable. And then she looked past him at the staging area, where 40-some competitors had stopped what they were doing with the particular frozen quality of people who understood they were witnessing something but didn't yet know what. She looked back at Nathan. "You've got the wrong person," she said. Her voice was flat, Not defensive, not nervous. Just flat, the way a fact is flat. Nathan didn't move. I don't think so. Reed. Commander Reed. She picked up the spotting case latch where she'd left off and clicked it shut. I don't know what you think you saw out there, but I'm a captain attached to the 3rd Infantry Division Sniper Section. I've been a competitive shooter for 6 years. What just happened was a good day in good conditions. The conditions were terrible, Nathan said. Manageable terrible. Nobody else managed them. She picked up the spotting case. Kane got 6 hits. De Silva got 6 hits. I got 7. The margin isn't... Ghost 1 got 7, Nathan said. Every time, regardless of conditions, in environments that made this range look like a training exercise. Something moved across Elena's face. It was brief, the kind of thing that only registered if you were already watching for it, and then it was gone. She set the spotting case down on the bench rather than picking it up, which was a small movement that said more than she probably intended. That's a call sign from a classified operation, she said quietly. Yes. You shouldn't be saying it in an open staging area. No, Nathan agreed. I shouldn't. They looked at each other. Around them, the staging area had not resumed its normal activity. People were doing a version of continuing to pack their gear, but the version was transparently thin, hands moving on equipment they weren't actually working on, conversations that had stopped mid-word. Decker was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his expression carefully uninformative. Bautista had stopped pretending to do anything at all. Kane was standing to Elena's left and behind her, far enough that she couldn't see him without turning. His face was doing the difficult work of composure. We should talk somewhere else, Elena said. Yes, Nathan said. We should. She picked up the spotting case. She picked up the rifle case with her other hand. She looked at Nathan once, a quick look that communicated direction without words, and walked toward the far exit of the staging area. Nathan followed her. The staging area waited until the door swung shut behind them, and then it exploded into exactly the kind of noise it had been holding back for the past 4 minutes. The installation had a small equipment maintenance bay on the north side of the main building, separate from the staging area. A workspace for cleaning and minor repairs with good overhead lighting and a long metal workbench that ran the length of the wall. It was empty at this hour. The heat had been left on low, which meant it was 48 degrees inside rather than 20 outside, which was close enough to comfortable that neither of them mentioned it. Elena set her cases on the workbench and didn't open them. She turned and leaned back against the bench with her arms crossed, not defensively, just a position that said she was done moving for a moment. Nathan closed the door and stood near it. Reyes? She said. He blinked. What? Victor Reyes. Was he on your team? Nathan's expression shifted in a way that confirmed the answer before he said it. He was. He got out 4 years ago. He's in Portland now, I think. Does something in construction management. Elena nodded once. He had a habit of eating cold MREs even when he had heat tabs. Said the cold ones tasted better. He still does that, Nathan said. Or he did, last time I saw him. I know, because I spent 3 days watching your team through a scope, she said. You learn things. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then you don't deny it. I didn't confirm it. That's the same thing. She looked at him. What do you want, Commander? He came away from the door a few steps. He wasn't aggressive about it. He moved like someone who understood the value of giving people space and was being careful with it. He stopped at a distance that said conversation, not confrontation. Korova Province, he said. March, 7 years ago. My team was running a capture or kill on a cell commander named Bashir Rahman. The intelligence was bad. I knew it was bad going in, which is something I've had a long time to live with. We walked into a 3-sided contact, 12 operators against approximately 60 fighters in prepared positions. He paused. We were in that valley for 71 hours. Elena said nothing. The first sniper support came at R3, Nathan continued. Single shooter. No spotter confirmation that we ever identified. Consistent suppression from a position we couldn't locate even with our own optics. And we were looking hard because we needed to know if the fire was friendly or if we were about to have a fourth problem. He paused again. It was friendly, extremely friendly. Over 3 days, the shooter took engagements at distances that our own unit's snipers told me, afterward, weren't feasible under those conditions. People do things under pressure that aren't technically feasible, Elena said. They do, Nathan agreed. But they also leave patterns, indicators. The shot selection was specific. High-value targets, fire team leaders, anyone carrying a radio. Never spray, never waste. The shooter understood our situation in real time, which meant they had eyes on us, which meant they were positioned to have eyes on us, which meant… He stopped. We looked. For 2 of those 71 hours, we had 2 operators running a back azimuth on the shooter's position based on muzzle flash observation. Did they find anything? No. A small silence. The shooter went cold at hour 71, Nathan said. Extraction team came in at hour 74. We got out. All 12 of us, which by any rational calculation of that contact should not have been possible. His voice was steady, but it had something in it now. Not emotion exactly, but the shape where emotion had been and had been pressed down into something more durable. I filed an after action. I requested identification of the supporting element. I was told the information was compartmentalized above my access level, which told me something about the kind of program I was dealing with. Elena was looking at the wall above his shoulder, not avoiding him, just looking at a point that wasn't anything. 7 years, she said. 7 years. And you think that shooter is me? I think the shooting I watched today is the same shooting I watched from the floor of that valley, Nathan said. I think the shot selection is the same. The patience is the same. The way you use the terrain and the environmental indicators rather than equipment, same. He looked at her directly. I'm not a ballistics analyst. I'm not running a formal identification, but I've been doing this for 18 years, Captain, and I know what I see. Elena uncrossed her arms and turned back to the bench. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked down at them. If what you're describing happened, she said carefully, it was a classified operation, which means the people involved had reasons for the compartmentalization. I know that. And those reasons don't expire because you've had 7 years to think about it. I know that too. So what do you actually want? She turned back to him. You can't identify me publicly without creating a problem. You can't pursue whatever you think you know without going through channels that will tell you the same thing they told you 7 years ago. Nathan was quiet. I don't want anything from you operationally, he said finally. I'm not trying to blow your cover or compromise your record or whatever it is you think I'm here to do. He stopped. Something moved through his face. I had operators who didn't come home from other missions. I had 3 men who came home from Korova province in condition they shouldn't have come home from at all. 2 of them are still working, which is not something their doctors predicted. He looked at her. And I had 12 men, including those 3, who came home alive from a situation that should have killed us. Because someone sat on a rock in the Korova Mountains for 71 hours in March and made decisions that I don't fully understand the reasoning behind. And the outcomes of those decisions were 12 people who are still alive. He stopped talking. Elena looked at him for a long moment. I need you to understand something, she said. Whoever that shooter was, whatever they did in that valley, they were doing a job. They weren't doing it for recognition. They weren't doing it because they wanted someone to find them afterward. The compartmentalization existed for a reason, and that reason included the shooter's safety and ongoing operational viability. She paused. Saying thank you to the wrong person in the wrong place because you're 90% sure and you need to close a loop. That's not closure. That's a liability. I know, Nathan said. So, I know, he said again. I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm not asking you to do anything with what I've said. He looked at her steadily. I just needed you to hear it. Whatever you did or didn't do. I needed someone who might know to hear that 12 people are alive, and that the debt for that is something I've been carrying, and I didn't know where to put it. The maintenance bay was quiet. Outside, faintly, they could hear the range activity resuming. Radios, vehicles, the distant crack of a rifle from one of the side ranges where some competitors were running additional practice. Elena looked at Nathan Reed for a long moment. Then she said, Victor still eating cold MREs is genuinely disturbing. Something in Nathan's face released, not dramatically, not a smile exactly, just a small release of tension that had been there so long it had become structural. "It really is," he said. They came back to the staging area separately, which was the sensible thing to do, and which fooled approximately nobody. Decker watched Elena come through the door first and return to her bench and resume packing with the same systematic efficiency she'd applied all day. And he understood that whatever had happened in the last 20 minutes was not going to be clarified voluntarily, which meant the speculation was going to run. The speculation had already started. By the time Nathan came back through the staging area door 3 minutes later, the conversations that had been happening in loud undertones stopped with the specific abruptness of conversations that know they're being observed. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He went to his own equipment and began packing it. The stage scores were posted on the board by mid-afternoon. Elena Cross, 7 for 7. Perfect run. Combined 4-stage score, 373. First place. Kane, combined score 371. Second place. The 2 points were the difference between a 6-hit run and a 7-hit run on Ice Fang. Wilkes read the results over the range PA system in his flat, efficient voice, and there was a specific quality to the silence that followed. Not stunned exactly, because by now the top of the observation platform had processed the reality, but something more complicated than simple acceptance. Kane heard his name in second place. He stood with his rifle case in his right hand and his expression showing nothing. Villegas beside him said something quiet that was lost in the ambient noise, and Kane nodded without looking at him. He turned and found Elena at her workbench. She was zipping her larger duffel closed. She had her back to him. "Captain Cross." She turned. Kane looked like he was doing math, the kind of math that involved variables he hadn't included in his original calculation. He was a man who prided himself on being accurate, and inaccuracy, when he found it, demanded correction. He held the rifle case at his side. He stood straight. "That was a 7-target run," he said. "Yeah. Ice Fang, 7 out of 7. He said it like he was still integrating it. "Nobody's done that. First time for everything." He looked at her. "I said some things yesterday, about the equipment, about what I expected." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "The equipment comment specifically. That was—" He stopped, started again. "Your rifle is a good rifle. You know what your rifle does and you used it accordingly. What I said implied otherwise. I was wrong about that." It was clearly not easy for him to say. That was visible in the way he said it. Precise, careful, like a man giving ground that cost him something. Elena nodded once. "Appreciate that." "The stage 2 score—" He stopped himself. "Never mind. That's—" He stopped again. "You shot a hell of a competition," he said, and this part was easier because it was simply true. "You had a good run," she said. "Target 7 in that wind was a hard problem." "I got beaten by 1 shot," he said. There was no bitterness in it, just fact. 7 shots, she said. 6 of them were even. He looked at her, and for a moment something passed across his face that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite confusion, but was some combination that he hadn't expected to feel. "What's your background?" he said. "Your unit, 3rd Infantry Division." Before that, she looked at him steadily. "That's the background that's relevant." Kane held her gaze for another second. Then he nodded, once, slowly, and picked up his equipment and walked out of the staging area. So, the awards ceremony was held in the installation's main briefing room, which had been minimally reconfigured for the purpose. A podium moved to the front, 3 chairs arranged beside it, the fluorescent lights adjusted slightly towards something that was trying to be less institutional and mostly succeeding. Wilkes ran it efficiently and without ceremony, because that was what this environment called for, and he understood that. Top 3 finishers were called up. Elena first, Kane second, Hutchins third. The award was a simple plaque, the kind that wouldn't look out of place on a wall or in a locker and didn't announce itself. There were handshakes. There were photographs, because there were always photographs. Elena stood at the podium with the plaque and looked at the camera with the expression of someone who was not entirely comfortable with the activity but understood its necessity and was cooperating with it. The applause was genuine. That was the thing. After 2 days of quiet skepticism and the specific social architecture that had been built around her presence at this event, the assumptions, the comments, the careful management of expectations, the applause that filled the briefing room when her name was called was not polite. It was real. 41 people who had spent careers learning to evaluate competence, who had spent 2 days watching a woman they'd collectively underestimated, who had watched her end the competition with a 7-shot perfect run on the hardest stage in the event. It was the kind of applause that acknowledged something that had shifted. Not everyone had shifted equally. Some of the people in the room were still processing. Some of them were going to spend the drive home working through their assumptions about what the result meant and why. And some of those conclusions were going to be uncomfortable. That was honest. The recalibration of a strongly held belief is not a clean process, and it doesn't happen all at once. But the applause was real. Elena accepted the plaque and shook Wilkes's hand and stepped back from the podium, and there was nothing in her face that said vindication. Nothing that said, "I told you so," even though she hadn't told anyone anything. Nothing that said what you expected. Just the same controlled, specific quiet she'd carried through the entire event. Bautista watched her from the third row and thought about Decker's comment from the previous night. "She's done better than I expected," and about how completely inadequate that sentence now sounded. He thought about the 7-year gap Nathan Reed had described, obliquely, to Bautista, over coffee after the maintenance bay conversation. How 7 years was a long time to be looking for a person, and how the finding of that person in the most unlikely possible venue was the kind of thing that made the universe seem less random, which was a feeling Bautista generally didn't trust, but was currently trusting against his better judgment. He thought about the way Elena had looked when Nathan said Ghost won. He'd seen that look before, on other people, in other contexts. It was the look of someone who had been somewhere that was still inside them, and who heard, unexpectedly, a word that opened a door they kept carefully shut. He'd seen that look before. He didn't like what it usually meant the person had been through. The parking lot was emptying by late afternoon, in the specific gradual way of events that end without a clear single moment of conclusion. People drifting out in ones and twos as they finished packing, trucks and SUVs and a few government vehicles pulling out in no particular order. Elena had her truck loaded by 3:30 and was running the final equipment check before she left. A habit so ingrained she did it without thinking, methodical, from right to left, same order every time. Rifle case in the bed, spotting case, duffels secured so they wouldn't shift on mountain roads. She was about to get in the cab when she heard boots on gravel. She didn't turn immediately. She heard the cadence and weight of the footsteps and categorized them without meaning to. Male, significant body weight, deliberate pace. Not approaching aggressively, just approaching. She turned. The man walking toward her was someone she hadn't seen at the staging area or the briefing room. He was in his 60s, civilian clothes that sat on him with the specific posture of someone who had worn a uniform for decades and never entirely stopped. Broad-shouldered in a way that hadn't been maintained but also hadn't entirely gone. His hair was white and cut short, and his face had the particular quality of a face that had been through a lot of weather and a lot of decisions. He stopped at the rear of the truck. "Captain Cross?" he said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry to catch you on your way out." He had a voice that was used to being heard in difficult conditions. "My name is Arthur Vance. I'm retired. You don't need my former title. I'm here as an observer. I've been observing events like this one for about a decade as part of a working group that advises on special operations training doctrine." He paused. "I was on the observation platform today." "Okay," Elena said. "I watched all 4 stages," he said. "I watched everyone compete. And I watched Nathan Reed walk out of this staging area behind you this afternoon." He looked at her directly, the look of a man who was going to say something specific. "I know who Nathan Reed is. I know what Karova Province was. I know what Ghost 1 means." He paused. "And I know that the program that produced that call sign was shut down 4 years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with its effectiveness." Elena kept her face even. "I'm not here to create a problem," Vance said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm here because the working group I mentioned has been building a case, a policy case, a formal recommendation for reconstituting certain elements of that program under a different administrative structure, one that is better designed to protect the people who operate inside it." He paused. And because the conversation I need to have in order to advance that case requires talking to people with direct experience. Elena looked at him for a long moment. I'm a captain in the 3rd Infantry Division Sniper Section, she said. I just won a marksmanship competition. That's the day I've had. Vance looked at her with the specific patience of someone who had been in enough conversations to know when a statement was a door being kept closed rather than a genuine denial. I understand, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. Plain white, a phone number, nothing else. He set it on the tailgate of her truck, not offering it to her hand, just setting it where she could choose to take it or not. When you're ready to have a different conversation, he said, that's how to reach me. He turned and walked back toward the installation. Elena looked at the card on the tailgate. She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment. The number, nothing else, no name, just 11 digits. And then she folded it once and put it in the breast pocket of her jacket. She got in the truck. She sat for a moment in the cab with the engine not yet running, her hands in her lap, looking out through the windshield at the mountain range she'd been shooting into for 2 days. The light was going. The peaks were catching the last of the afternoon sun on their upper faces, that particular gold that lasted maybe 20 minutes before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees and everything went blue. In her breast pocket, the card. In her memory, the exact coordinates of 7 targets and the specific wind conditions that had been present at each one. And somewhere in the classified architecture of an operation that officially didn't exist in any format available to standard inquiry, a call sign that a Navy commander had spent 7 years carrying and had come, finally, to put down. She started the engine. The Tacoma moved out of the parking lot and onto the road heading south, and the mountains stayed exactly where they were. The road south from Harker Mountain ran 46 miles of 2-lane before it hit the state highway, and for most of those 46 miles, there was nothing on either side but pine forest and the occasional pull-off where someone had built a fire ring from river stones and abandoned it. Elena drove without music. The card was in her breast pocket. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a splinter. Not painful, just present, a small specific pressure that didn't go away when you stopped thinking about it. Vance. Arthur Vance. She'd run the name through her memory the same way she ran everything through her memory, methodically, cross-referencing against what she actually knew versus what she'd heard versus what was inference, and what she came back with was fragments. A name that appeared in a briefing document she'd seen 4 years ago, adjacent to a discussion of program restructuring. A name that one of her handlers had mentioned once, in passing, with the specific neutrality that meant the person was significant, and the significance was not to be elaborated on. She hadn't connected the name to a face until 40 minutes ago. She drove. The mountains held the cold long after the valleys lost the light, and by the time she hit the state highway, the temperature outside had dropped 12 degrees, and the first stars were visible in the east, sharp and close in the high-altitude air. She turned south and let the truck find its speed. The phone in the cup holder rang at mile 63. Unknown number. Area code she didn't recognize. She picked it up. Cross? Silence for 2 seconds. Then, "It's Vance." She said nothing. "I apologize for the timing," he said. "I want to add something to what I said in the parking lot, something I should have led with." A pause. The working group's recommendation is time-sensitive. There's a formal review in front of the Joint Special Operations Oversight Board in 11 days. If we don't have documented first-hand testimony to support the policy case, the recommendation dies. Another pause. "I'm not asking you to do anything tonight. I'm asking you to think." "I've been thinking," she said. "Good." "I haven't been thinking about your timeline." "I understand." 11 days, she said. "You held this event for how long?" A brief silence that told her he understood the implication. "The scheduling wasn't in my control." "What kind of testimony?" "Written, ideally supported by oral. Operational context, methodology, effectiveness metrics. Nothing that compromises current assets or ongoing programs." He paused. "Your record, the parts of your record that exist in formats I can access, is incomplete in ways that are themselves informative. The Oversight Board needs more than gaps. They need substance. And if I'm not who you think I am, then I've wasted your time and mine, and I apologize." His voice was level. "But I've been doing this long enough to know what I saw today, Captain, and what Nathan Reed told me tonight." She gripped the wheel. Reed talked to you. He called me 2 hours ago. He didn't tell me anything I didn't already believe. He confirmed the direction. Vance paused. He also told me to tell you that Victor Reyes is in Portland and he's doing well. He thought that might matter to you. Elena looked at the road ahead. The headlights pushed 200 feet into the dark, and the dark pushed back. I'll think about it, she said. She ended the call. The card stayed in her pocket for the next 4 hours of driving, and when she finally pulled off at a truck stop outside of a small city called Garnet Falls and sat in a booth with coffee that was better than the installations by a significant margin, she took the card out and set it flat on the table in front of her and looked at it. 11 digits. 11 days. She thought about Korova Province the way she always thought about it. Not as a narrative, not as a sequence of events with a beginning and middle and end, but as a set of specific sensory data that had been filed in a part of her memory that was separate from normal recall. The cold of the rock face she'd been positioned on for most of 71 hours. The specific sound of fire contact at varying distances. The way you learned to read it, not as a single noise, but as a system of overlapping sounds that told you things. The moment, hour 53, she was precise about it, when she'd understood that the team below her had run critically low on water and that the tactical situation was not resolving, and that the decision she was about to make was the kind of decision that people who made decisions like that were not supposed to make. She'd made it anyway. She put the card back in her pocket and finished her coffee and got back in the truck. Garnet Falls was an hour behind her when the radio scanner on the passenger seat, a habit from years of work in environments where information moved faster through unofficial channels than official ones, picked up the state police frequency and started producing traffic that made her slow down. Vehicle accident. State Route 7, mile marker 34. Multiple casualties reported. Requesting additional units and medical support. ETA on ambulance from Garnet Falls, 14 minutes. She was at mile marker 31. She pulled over onto the shoulder and sat for 3 seconds doing the math. 14 minutes, multiple casualties. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes south, which meant whoever was at mile marker 34 right now was waiting. And then she pulled back onto the road and accelerated. The accident was a two-vehicle collision, head-on or close to it, and she could see it from a quarter-mile away by the headlights of the other stopped vehicles and the way the road was blocked. She pulled off well short of the scene and came in on foot, fast. What she found was not good. A pickup truck and a compact sedan. One of them having crossed the center line in a curve where the road dropped and the ice was black. The pickup was in the ditch on the right shoulder at a severe angle. The sedan had taken the impact on the driver's side and crumpled accordingly. 2 civilians were already at the scene, a man and a woman who had stopped before Elena and who were standing at the edge of the light, looking at the sedan with the specific frozen quality of people who wanted to help and didn't know how. "Did you call 911?" Elena said. "Yes," the woman said. "They said 14 minutes, I know." Elena moved to the sedan. "Anyone conscious in there?" From the sedan, a sound, not words, a sound that meant someone was alive. She tried the passenger door, jammed. She moved to the rear passenger door, accessible, the frame hadn't compressed enough to lock it, and got it open. Interior, 2 people in front. Driver was a woman, unconscious or close to it, seatbelt on, airbag deployed. Passenger was a teenage boy, conscious, bleeding from the face, saying something she couldn't immediately parse. "Hey," she said directly and level. "Look at me." He looked at her. "What's your name?" "Jamie." "Jamie, are you hurting anywhere besides your face?" He touched his chest, winced. "Okay, don't move." She did a fast visual on the driver. Her mother, probably, given the age difference, given the way Jamie had looked at her immediately. "Is that your mom?" "Yeah." His voice was thin. The driver's breathing was audible from the back seat. Shallow, fast, with an irregularity that Elena cataloged and didn't like. She scanned what she could see. Neck looked intact, head injury possible. The airbag had done its job, but the door had also come in 12 inches on the driver's side. The woman's left arm was in a position that was going to be a problem. "She's breathing," Elena told Jamie. "That's what matters right now." She backed out and stood and looked at the 2 civilians. The man was maybe 50, solid, the look of someone who worked outdoors. "Can you hold a light?" she said. Yes. Phone flashlight, full brightness. I need to see inside this car. She was already moving. Don't touch her. Don't move her. Just light. He had his phone out before she finished the sentence. She went back in through the rear door and worked quickly and without commentary, running a trauma assessment with her hands, because her hands knew how to do this in the dark and had for a long time. Checking pulse at the carotid, present, faster than she wanted. Checking the airway, clear. Checking the chest, which was where the sound she'd been hearing was coming from, a quality of breathing that had a specific name in the training she'd done, and the name was not a reassuring one. She needs to stay still, she said to Jamie. If she wakes up, you tell her she has to stay still. Can you do that? Yeah. He was pressing both hands against his own face where it was bleeding, which was good instinct. You're doing good, she said. She backed out and stood up. 12 minutes to the ambulance, she went to the pickup in the ditch. Single driver, male, conscious and agitated, already trying to get out of the cab on the uphill side. Elena got to him before he managed it. Stay in the vehicle. I'm fine, I just need to… Sir. Her voice dropped into something that was not loud but was extremely clear. The vehicle is on an angle and you're going to go down the ditch bank if you get out on that side. Stay in the vehicle. He stopped. Are you hurt? My shoulder. He touched his left shoulder. I think I hit the window. Any head pain? Some. Stay put. Help is coming. She looked at him for another 2 seconds, running the check. No acute distress beyond the shoulder. Alert, oriented, pupils she could see in the phone's ambient light were roughly equal. She'd monitor. She went back to the sedan. The woman was stirring. Hey, Elena said, leaning in. Don't move. I need you to stay still. The woman's eyes opened, unfocused. Jamie? He's right there, Elena said. He's okay, but you have to stay still. My arm. I know about your arm. We're going to deal with that when the paramedics get here. Right now, you stay exactly where you are. The woman made a sound that was half acknowledgement and half pain, and tried to move her left arm, and Elena put her hand on the woman's right shoulder, gentle, firm, and said, No, still. The woman went still. Good, Elena said. That's exactly right. She stayed in the back seat for the next 9 minutes, monitoring both occupants, talking to Jamie at intervals to keep him calm and to monitor his consciousness level, tracking the driver's breathing and watching for the change in that sound that would mean the situation had escalated to something she couldn't manage without equipment she didn't have. The sound didn't change. The ambulance arrived at 12 minutes and 40 seconds, which was better than the original estimate. When the first paramedic came to the rear door, Elena gave him a handoff in under 30 seconds. What she'd found, what she'd done, what she was concerned about, what she was watching. Specific, sequenced, no wasted words. He looked at her. You a medic? Bystander, she said. He looked at her for another second, then turned to his partner and began relaying what she'd told him in the same specific language she'd used. She backed away from the scene as the professionals took over, which was what you were supposed to do, and stood on the road shoulder with the 2 civilians who had been there before her, the man and the woman. The woman was crying quietly. The release of adrenaline, the letting go of the terrible helpless feeling of being at a scene you can't help. The man was looking at Elena. What did you say you were? He said. Bystander, she said. He looked at the scene, the paramedics working efficiently, the driver being assessed, Jamie sitting up in the back seat talking to a young EMT who had him laughing about something, which was remarkable. Sure, the man said. She got back to her apartment in Dellard City at 2 in the morning. Dellard City was not a city in any meaningful sense. It was a post-military boom town that had grown around a base that had since contracted, leaving behind a collection of box stores and duplex housing developments, and one good diner that had outlasted 3 ownership changes and was still, somehow, the best coffee within 40 miles. Her apartment was in a building that was 5 years old and felt like it. Thin walls, heating that was either working or not with nothing in between. A parking lot that flooded when it rained. She liked it fine. She showered and put her gear away in the order she always put it away and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the card on the nightstand where she'd put it when she came in. 11 days. She had a O-600 formation in 4 days. She had a training rotation scheduled for the following week. She had, if she counted, approximately 6 people at her unit who knew her as Elena Cross and understood her capabilities inside the parameters of what she'd shown them, and precisely none of them had any reason to think the parameters were incomplete. That was the design. That was how it was supposed to work. She picked up her personal phone and looked at the contacts list, scrolled to a name that wasn't labeled as a name, just a string of 3 letters that meant something to her and nothing to anyone who might look at her phone without context. She thought about calling. She didn't call. She set the phone on the nightstand next to the card and lay back and looked at the ceiling and was asleep in 4 minutes, because she'd learned to sleep when she could, regardless of what her brain was doing, and her brain had been doing a lot. She was at the diner by 0630. She'd been a regular long enough that the morning counter person, a woman named Dee, who was in her 50s and had worked there through 2 ownership changes and showed no signs of stopping, put the coffee down without being asked. "You look like you drove all night," Dee said. "Most of it." "Competition thing?" "Yeah." "How'd you do?" Elena wrapped both hands around the mug. "Fine." Dee had known her for 2 years and knew that fine from Elena Cross meant she was not going to get more information, and she was also not the kind of person who pushed, which was part of why Elena liked the diner. She was on her second coffee and working through eggs when the door opened and she registered the sound without looking up. Cold air, single pair of boots, medium weight, deliberate, and her brain categorized it before she connected it to anything, and then she connected it to something and looked up. Nathan Reed. He was in civilian clothes, wool coat, dark jeans, and he looked like he'd driven through the night too, which he probably had. He saw her immediately and came to the counter and sat on the stool 2 down from her without being invited, which told her the conversation was not optional. Dee raised an eyebrow from the coffee station. Elena nodded. Nathan got coffee. "How'd you find me?" Elena said. "I'm a naval commander with a security clearance that would make your eyes water," he said. "I found your home of record." He looked at the mug. "I drove through the night because I had something I needed to say in person, and the phone felt wrong for it." "More than yesterday?" "Different than yesterday." He turned the mug on the counter. "Vance called me after he called you." I gathered. "He told me what he told you, the 11 days, the oversight board." Nathan paused. "I've known about the working group for 3 years. I've been part of the informal advisory structure around it. Non-official, nothing documented, just conversations." He looked at her directly. "I told Vance about Ghost 1. I told him what I told you at the staging area, the broad strokes. I did it because I believed it would strengthen the case." He stopped. "I should have told you I was going to do that before I did it." Elena looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "You should have." "I know." He held the look. "I'm sorry." The diner was quiet. Early morning, 2 other customers at the far end of the counter, both of them oriented away. "What's the argument?" Elena said. "The policy case. What are they actually arguing for?" Nathan set the mug down. "The program that produced your call sign was administratively simple, which was also its problem. Single-layer oversight. When the oversight layer got politicized, the whole program became a target. The restructuring proposal puts it under a joint board with 3 separate command authorities, which means it can't be killed by one decision at one level." He paused. "It also means the people operating inside it have protections they didn't have." 4 years ago, Elena said. 4 years ago. She looked at her eggs. "The program got shut down 4 years ago, and I'm a captain in the 3rd Infantry Division Sniper Section. Those are the facts I'm working with." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "When was the last time you worked at the level you worked at on that range?" She didn't answer. "That's what I thought," he said. Not unkindly, just observationally. She pushed the plate back slightly. "What do you want from me specifically, Commander? Not the working group. You. What are you doing sitting in my diner at 700? Nathan Reed looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared for a conversation and found it harder than he'd prepared for. "I want you back in a role that uses what you can actually do," he said. "Selfish reason. I want to know the capability exists in a structure that can deploy it. Personal reason. Because you spent 71 hours making a decision that wasn't yours to make, that nobody asked you to make, that you made anyway, and what it bought was 12 lives. He stopped. And right now you're running competitive marksmanship events and being underestimated by colonels. He picked up the mug. That's a waste. Elena Cross sat with that for a moment. You should eat something, she said finally. Dee makes good eggs. Nathan blinked. I'm not saying yes to anything, she said, but you drove all night and you look like it, and I'm not going to have a conversation with someone who hasn't eaten. She glanced at Dee. 2 more. Dee didn't ask questions. She never did. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The specific, comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other's language even if they weren't using it. And when Nathan had finished most of his eggs, he said, without preamble, There's something else. Elena set her fork down. Vance has a contact at the oversight board, Nathan said. A general officer. I won't name him without authorization. The review in 11 days isn't just about the program structure. There's a competing proposal on the table that would absorb the program into a different architecture entirely, one that centralizes it under a single command authority. The person pushing that proposal is a 2-star named Dowell. He paused. Dowell ran the oversight layer that got politicized 4 years ago. Elena was very still. The same person, she said. The same person. She looked at Nathan. And if Dowell's proposal passes, the program gets rebuilt under the exact same structural vulnerability that killed it the first time. Nathan's voice was flat. With Dowell in a position to direct it rather than oversight it. He picked up his mug, which is a different kind of problem. The diner's bell over the door rang as someone came in. Both of them registered it and categorized it automatically and let it go, a habit neither of them had to think about. How solid is Vance's case without testimony? Elena said. Defensible. Not strong. Nathan set the mug down. The gaps in your record, the classified gaps, they're inferable to someone who knows what to look for. Vance knows what to look for. The board members he needs to convince may not, and testimony makes them inferable to people who don't know what to look for. Testimony makes them concrete. There's a difference between a record with suspicious gaps and a record that a credible witness can explain. He paused. You're the credible witness. Elena looked at her coffee. The thing about Korova Province that she didn't think about as a narrative was that it had an ending. The ending was 74 hours. The ending was an extraction. The ending was 12 men loading onto helicopters and rising out of a valley and going home. She'd watched through the scope. She'd watched until the helicopters were gone and the valley was quiet again, and then she'd begun the extraction of her own, which was a different kind of process. Slower, more deliberate, moving through terrain that was still active with the fighters who'd had 12 targets pulled out from under them and were looking for somewhere to direct that energy. She'd made it. She always made it, which was not the same as it being fine. I need to make some calls, she said. Nathan nodded. Give me 48 hours. The timeline? 48 hours, she said again, to verify what you're telling me is accurate and talk to the people I need to talk to before I put my name on anything. She looked at him. I've had people give me accurate intelligence before. I've also had people give me what they believed was accurate intelligence that turned out to be incomplete in ways that mattered. She held his gaze. No offense. None taken, he said. 48 hours is reasonable. She left cash on the counter and stood. The program produced 3 operational personnel, she said, not looking at him, just at the door. I don't know where the other 2 are. I don't know if they want to be found. She picked up her jacket. If Vance's case is about policy and structure, it can be built on operational outcomes and effectiveness metrics from the classified record. It doesn't require faces. It's stronger with faces, Nathan said. Most things are. She put on the jacket. 48 hours. She walked out. The cold hit her immediately. Sharp, clean, the kind of morning air that clarified things. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her pockets, looking at nothing in particular, running the math in her head the same way she ran every problem. Variables, unknowns, the information she had versus the information she needed. Dowell. She knew the name, not from a briefing document, from a conversation, a single conversation, years ago, in a room she wasn't technically supposed to be in, with a handler who had been careful about what he said and still said enough. If Dowell got the program wasn't the only thing at risk. The people who'd operated inside it were at risk. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. She pulled out her phone and looked at the contact list. 3 letters. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. "Yeah," said a voice on the other end. "Male. Hoarse with sleep. She'd woken him, which meant he was somewhere in a different time zone or had been working late. Probably both." "It's Cross," she said. A brief silence. The particular silence of someone waking up fast, the way you learn to do when your phone ringing could mean something. "How bad?" the voice said. "Scale of 1 to Korova," she said. "I'd say 4, maybe 5. Another silence. "Give me 6 hours," the voice said. "I need 48. I'll give you 6 and then we talk." She almost argued. She didn't. 6 hours, she said. She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk outside the diner in Delard City, with the mountains visible in the distance, snow-capped against a pale blue sky. And she thought about the card from Vance, and the conversation with Nathan, and the name Dowell sitting heavy in the back of her mind like a piece of unspent ordnance. She thought about the working group and the 11 days and the 12 men who had gone home from Korova Province, and the 2 others from the program who were somewhere she didn't know. She thought about a 16-year-old Tacoma with a cracked window, and a rifle case that needed new latches, and a competition plaque she hadn't yet decided where to put. She started walking back to her apartment. The mountains stayed exactly where they were, but the ground beneath them was shifting. 6 hours turned into 5. The callback came at 11:42, while Elena was sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open and 3 separate documents pulled up. A redacted operational summary she'd kept a personal copy of for reasons she'd told herself were archival and had always known were something else. A publicly available biography of a 2-star general named Harlan Dowell that had been scrubbed of anything interesting, and a blank document she hadn't yet typed anything into. The phone rang, and she picked it up. "Talk to me," she said. The voice on the other end belonged to a man she knew as Garrett. That was not his name. She'd known his actual name once, early in their working relationship, and had then been instructed to forget it, and had done so with the specific deliberateness of someone who understood that knowing things you weren't supposed to know was a liability that distributed itself in unexpected directions. Garrett had been her primary handler for 3 years before the program was shut down. He was thorough, careful, and entirely willing to tell her things she didn't want to hear, which made him one of the more trustworthy people she'd worked with. "Vance is legitimate," Garrett said. "Working group is real, been active for 2 years. 3 members of the Joint Special Operations Oversight Board have been briefed at the working level. The proposal is solid structurally." A pause. She heard him drinking something. Coffee, probably. "Dowell is also real, which you already knew. Tell me about the competing proposal." "It's been in development for 8 months. Dowell's been working the board quietly, informal conversations, not formal submissions. His argument is efficiency. Centralized command is faster, fewer decision layers, better operational tempo." Another pause. "The efficiency argument is not wrong. It's also not the point." "No. The point is who's running the centralized command." She heard him set the mug down. "Dowell's proposal puts the program under a new directorate that he has been positioning himself to head for the better part of a year. The board members who've heard his pitch don't know that part. They think they're evaluating an organizational structure. They're actually evaluating whether to hand Dowell a capability he's been trying to acquire since the original program was stood down." Elena was quiet. "Why did he shut it down the first time?" she said. A longer pause this time. "The official reason was oversight complexity and classification management issues," Garrett said. "The actual reason, which I am telling you based on things I was not supposed to know and cannot attribute, is that he had an operational request denied. He wanted the program to support a mission that the program's oversight board determined was outside the authorized use parameters." "What mission?" "Something in a country we were not operationally present in." Garrett's voice was flat. "The request was denied. The oversight board flagged the denial. 3 weeks later, Dowell found an administrative mechanism to initiate a program review, and 5 months after that, the program was shut down for the reasons that are on the official record." He paused. "The people who denied the request are retired or reassigned. The flag is in a file that Dowell's office controls." Elena looked at the blank document on her laptop. "If Dowell gets the restructured program," she said, "then there's no oversight board to deny requests," Garrett said. There's Dowell. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear a car pass on the street below, the sound Doppler shifting away. Vance needs testimony, she said. Vance needs testimony that makes the alternative look credible and the structure looks sound and doesn't create a security problem by existing. A pause. That's a narrow corridor. Can it be done? You tell me. He wasn't being rhetorical. He was actually asking. Elena thought about it. Specifically, procedurally, the way she thought about problems that had parameters and required a solution within those parameters. Testimony that established operational effectiveness without compromising sources, methods, or ongoing assets. Testimony that demonstrated why program structure mattered without revealing the specifics of what structure had failed. Testimony that put a real face on an abstract policy argument without making the face a target. It can be done, she said, carefully. When have you ever done it any other way? Garrett said, and she could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite humor and wasn't quite warmth, but was some combination of the two that she'd only ever heard from people who'd been in difficult places together. What about the other two? She said. Another pause. Morales is out. She went private sector, she's got a family, she's not going to want this. And the other one? Halloran is dead. Garrett said it directly, without softening. 18 months ago, medical. He'd been having problems since Venik province. You know what that operation was like. Elena said nothing for a moment. She hadn't known Halloran well. The program was specifically designed so that its personnel didn't know each other well, but she'd known enough in the way you knew people you operated alongside without ever sharing a staging area. How old was he? 38? She let that sit. Okay, she said. I'll talk to Vance, but I need the Dowell file. The request that was denied, the oversight flag. Not the official record, the actual record. That's not something I can give you, Garrett said. I know. A pause. I know someone who can point you toward where it lives, he said. Whether you can get to it from there is a different problem. That's enough. Elena. He said her name the way people say names when they're about to say something they've been deciding whether to say. This is going to put you in front of people who are going to ask you things you've been not answering for 4 years. I know. Your career as you currently have it organized is going to look different afterward. I know that too. Just making sure. Garrett, she said his not name the same way he'd said hers. I watched Halloran work for 2 years. He was careful, and he was good, and he died at 38 from problems that started in a program that got killed so that a 2-star could manage his frustration about a denied request. She looked at the blank document. I know what I'm deciding. A silence. I'll send you the contact information in the usual way, he said. He hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and then set it down and pulled the blank document to the front of the screen and began to type. She called Vance at 1300. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting. I'll testify, she said. Written statement first, oral if the board requires it. I have conditions. Tell me. The statement is reviewed by me and a security officer I designate before it goes to the board. Nothing that compromises current assets, nothing that identifies operational partners without their consent. Agreed. My name stays out of the public record. The board gets my identity for verification purposes, but I'm identified in the formal record by service number only. A brief pause. That will require a specific board accommodation. Can you get it? Yes. Then agreed. She paused. Third condition. The competing proposal, Dowell's proposal, needs to be formally on the record as the alternative being evaluated. I want the board to understand specifically what they're choosing between. A longer pause this time. That's a political ask, Vance said carefully. It's a factual ask. If the board is making a structural decision, they should have both structures in front of them. Dowell has relationships on this board. I know. She kept her voice even. I'm also aware of a specific administrative action from 4 years ago that created the circumstances that led to the program's termination. I'd like that action to be part of the record the board reviews. Vance was quiet for 3 seconds. You have documentation, he said. It wasn't a question. I will have documentation, she said. Within 48 hours. Another pause, longer. Captain Cross, I want to be transparent with you about something. What you're describing, putting Dowell's history formally in front of a review board that he has relationships on, that's not a standard policy conversation. That's something else. I know what it is, she said. It will generate a response. From him. Yes. And you're prepared for that. She looked at the document on her screen, 3 paragraphs now, the beginning of something that she'd been deciding whether to write for 4 years. I spent 71 hours in the Kurova Mountains making decisions I wasn't authorized to make because the authorized decisions were going to get 12 people killed, she said. This is considerably less exposed than that. Vance exhaled slowly through the phone. All right, he said. Let's build the case. The contact Garrett pointed her toward was a civilian analyst named Pruitt, who worked in a building in a mid-sized city that Elena reached by a 6-hour drive she did the following morning, leaving at 400 and arriving at an address that turned out to be an accountant's office building in a business park, which was either a very good cover or a very bad one, and turned out to be neither because Pruitt worked on the 4th floor of the actual building, and the accountants on the ground floor had no idea he existed in any meaningful sense. He was a small man in his 40s with the look of someone who had spent decades in rooms with no natural light, and he shook her hand with the specific formality of someone conducting a transaction that he wanted to be finished with as quickly as possible. I was told you needed access to the formal record of a program termination proceeding, he said. Specifically, the administrative action that initiated the review. I'm aware of what specifically. He turned to his workstation. I want to be clear that what I'm providing is a document that exists in a formal archive that is correctly classified at the level it's currently classified, and that I am authorized to access for the purposes of classification review. He was typing as he talked. The classification review is an ongoing process. You are assisting with that review in an advisory capacity. I'm an infantry captain, Elena said. You're a consultant for the classification review, Pruitt said, without looking up. For the next 45 minutes. A printer on his right produced 3 pages. He picked them up without looking at them and put them face down on the desk beside her. The review process benefits from eyes that can evaluate operational context, he said. When you've completed your evaluation, those pages go in the shredder and your consultation is complete. He got up and walked to the far end of the room and put headphones on and began doing something else. Elena picked up the pages and read them. The administrative action was a form she'd never seen before, a specific mechanism for initiating a program review that operated through a different channel than normal oversight processes. The form had a filing date, a signatory, and an attached brief summarizing the stated grounds for review. Classification management deficiencies, oversight layer redundancy, efficiency of command structure. The signatory was Harlan Dowell. The filing date was 22 days after the formal record showed an operational request had been submitted and denied by the program's oversight board. The denied request was attached as an appendix. It was 3 pages. It described an operation in specific terms: target, method, timeline, expected outcome. It had been denied on the grounds that the specified target and location were outside the program's authorized operational parameters, and that approval would require National Command Authority involvement that was not being sought. The operation was for a targeted elimination in a country where no U.S. forces were authorized to operate, against a target who was not on any formally authorized list. The target had a name that meant nothing to Elena. What mattered was what the target had been described as in the request. The request described the target as a political figure whose activities were described in language that, reading carefully, meant someone who had been an obstacle to a business arrangement that Dowell's language in the formal request didn't directly mention, but the appendix's financial annex, which was 3 additional pages, made considerably less obscure. She read the financial annex twice. She looked up at Pruitt, who still had his headphones on and was looking at a different screen. She put the pages in the shredder herself, which was the arrangement, and drove back to Dellard City and sat in her apartment for an hour before she called Vance. It's worse than I thought, she said. How much worse? She told him. Vance was quiet for a long time. If that annex is what you're describing, he said finally, it's not a policy problem, it's a criminal referral. Yes. Which is outside the scope of the Oversight Board review. The board can still see it, Elena said. They can make their own determination about what to do with it. Elena. Vance used her first name for the first time, which told her something about where the conversation was going. If I walk into that board review with what you've just described, Dowell is going to know within 24 hours. The board members who have relationships with him, at least 2 of them, are going to tell him, and then this becomes something considerably larger than a policy recommendation. I know. You've thought about what that means for you specifically. Yes. And? Elena looked at the plaque on her kitchen counter where she'd put it when she came in from the competition. The simple rectangle of it, undecorated, the kind of thing that was a fact rather than a display. She looked at it for a moment. Halloran died at 38, she said. Garrett told me yesterday. The program got shut down so that a general could protect a business arrangement. And one of the people who operated in that program is dead from problems that started because of how he was used and then discarded. And the person who made that decision is currently trying to rebuild the same program under his direct control. She paused. I'm 34. I'd like that number to keep going. Vance was quiet. What do you need from me? She said. A written statement that covers your operational background, the program's effectiveness, and the structural argument for the new oversight model, he said. The Dowell material, the annex. I need that documented through a channel that doesn't go through me. I know someone at the Inspector General's office who handles referrals from the intelligence community. If that material goes to them directly, it's in a formal process before Dowell can do anything about it. And the board review still happens. The board review still happens. 11 days. And we make the case we were going to make. The IG referral is a parallel track, he paused. This is going to take both of us doing things that are professionally uncomfortable. What are you doing? I'm staking a decade of advisory relationships on the accuracy of what you've told me and the strength of a case that depends significantly on the testimony of a captain whose record has classified gaps that the board is going to notice. His voice was dry without being bitter. That's uncomfortable. I'll get you the statement. I know you will. A pause. There's a meeting in 6 days I need you at in person. Washington, the board's pre-review session. Not formal testimony, a briefing. The board chair wants to hear the operational context before the formal review. 6 days. Can you manage that? She thought about her training rotation, her 0600 formations, the normal architecture of a life she'd built around being a person who was exactly who she appeared to be. I'll need to take emergency leave, she said. I can facilitate that through channels that don't require detailed explanation. My unit commander is going to have questions. Your unit commander will receive a request from a Joint Task Force Directorate for your temporary assignment to an advisory role. It won't answer his questions, but it'll be official enough that he can't block it. Elena thought about Major Donahue, her unit commander, a solid, practical man who ran a tight section and had, on 2 separate occasions, told her she was the best shot he'd ever supervised, with the specific tone of someone who found the fact slightly inconvenient because it complicated the straightforward mental picture he had of her. He was going to be frustrated. He was going to ask questions she wasn't going to answer. He was going to move forward anyway, because that was how he operated. Okay, she said, 6 days. I'll send you the details. Vance. She stopped him before he hung up. The statement I'm going to write. There are operational specifics I won't be able to include. Things I'm not authorized to disclose unilaterally, regardless of classification level. The statement will have gaps. I know. The board is going to push on the gaps. Yes. I need to know going in what they're going to push on and what they're prepared to accept as sufficient. The board chair is a retired 4-star named Calloway, Vance said. He was Joint Chief Staff for 6 years before he retired. He knows what classified gaps look like and why they exist. He's not going to push past what's legal. A pause. The 2 board members with Dowell relationships are different. They're going to push on everything they can. He paused again. That's going to be unpleasant. I've been through unpleasant. This kind of unpleasant is different from field unpleasant. I know. She'd been in rooms before, not briefing rooms, different kinds of rooms, but rooms where the pressure was interpersonal rather than physical, and where the objective was to make you uncertain about what you knew. She'd been in those rooms and come out of them intact. I'll be fine. I believe you, Vance said, for whatever it's worth. She hung up and opened her laptop and pulled up the blank document and began writing in earnest. She filed for emergency leave at 800 the next morning. Donahue called her into his office at 900, which was fast even for him. He was a lean man in his mid-40s who moved like someone who'd done a lot of his work on foot in terrain that didn't forgive slow decision-making. He had a way of sitting at his desk that looked relaxed and wasn't. The kind of physical composure that meant he was paying full attention to everything. The temporary assignment request was on his desk. Joint Task Force Advisory Role, he said. Yes, sir. Which Joint Task Force? I'm not able to provide that detail, sir. He looked at the document. This is signed at a level that means I have to let you go. He looked up. That's the part I find interesting. Not that you're requested, that the signature level is what it is. Elena stood at modified parade rest and said nothing. You won an invitational at Harker 2 days ago, he said. Yes, sir. 7 for 7 on Ice Fang. He'd heard already, which she'd expected. Word moved fast in small professional communities. That's never been done. Once now, sir. He looked at her with the expression he sometimes got. The expression that meant he was doing the specific math of a person who had 2 pictures of someone and was trying to figure out why they didn't line up. Cross. You've been in my section for 14 months. I know what you can do with a rifle. I know you run a good training program. You run a clean section. Your people trust you. He paused. I don't know a significant number of things about your background that are, apparently, significant. Sir, I'm not asking you to tell me, he said. I know what the classification architecture looks like when it's in my face. He tapped the assignment request. I'm telling you what I observe, which is that, whatever this is, it's not a routine advisory request. He paused. Are you okay? The question was direct and genuine and slightly unexpected. Yes, sir, she said, not being pressured into something you don't want to do. No, sir, this is my choice. He held her gaze for a moment, running whatever internal assessment he was running. Then he nodded once and initialed the bottom of the request. 2 weeks, he said. If it runs longer, I need to hear from someone official. Understood, sir. She was at the door when he said, Cross. She turned. That 7th target, he said, in those wind conditions. What did you use for the terminal drift calculation? She looked at him, observed mirage pattern at the 500-meter mark combined with the wind flag behavior at 600, she said. The valley was creating a consistent left-to-right gradient with a gust overlay. I calculated for the gradient and accepted the gust variability. He nodded slowly. And you trusted that calculation at 2+ kilometers? Yes, sir. Because it was the right calculation. Donahue looked at her for another second. Have a good trip, Captain. The written statement took her 3 days to produce in a form she was satisfied with. Not because the writing was hard, but because the calibration was hard. Every sentence had to carry weight without carrying more than was authorized. Every gap had to be a deliberate gap, not an accidental one. She wrote it and revised it 4 times and sent it to Garrett for a security review that he turned around in 18 hours with 2 small edits and a comment that said, in its entirety, "This is good work." She drove to Dellard City's small regional airport at 05:30 on the 6th day and parked in the long-term lot and sat in the Tacoma for a moment before she got out. She'd packed light, 2 days of clothes, her laptop, a notebook, the specific kind of minimal that meant she could move fast if she needed to. She'd been in too many situations where having too much gear with you was its own problem. She got out of the truck. The terminal was small and mostly empty at this hour. A handful of early travelers, a gate agent who was still setting up, the particular institutional quiet of airports before the day's traffic built. She checked in and found a seat near the window and watched the pre-dawn sky go from dark blue to pale gray over the runway. She wasn't nervous. That was something she'd learned to notice about herself over years of work in environments where nervousness was information, where the presence or absence of it told you something about whether your threat assessment was accurate. She wasn't nervous now, which meant that some part of her, below the level of analysis, had concluded that the threat was manageable. Not small, not without consequence, but manageable. She thought about the statement in her bag, and the 3 pages she'd read in Pruitt's office, and the name Halloran and the number 38. She thought about the valley at Korova Province and the specific quality of stillness that came at R40 when she'd been on that rock face long enough that the cold had stopped being something that happened to her and become something she was part of. And the scope was an extension of her eyes rather than a piece of equipment, and the decisions had a clarity that she hadn't experienced before or since in quite the same way. The gate agent called the flight. She picked up her bag. Nathan Reed was sitting 3 rows back on the aircraft, which she discovered when she was halfway down the aisle. He had the window seat, a coffee from somewhere, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular moment and was allowing himself a small amount of satisfaction about the fact that it had arrived. She stopped at his row. "Advisory role?" she said. "Witness coordination?" he said. "Vance asked me to brief the board on the Korova Province contact and its operational outcomes, as the unit commander on the ground." She looked at him. "You could have told me you were on this flight," she said. "I could have," he agreed. She moved to her seat, which was 4 rows forward. She sat down and put her bag in the overhead and settled in and looked out the window at the gray tarmac. Behind her, Nathan's voice carried forward just enough. "Victor's actually doing really well, by the way. Bought a house." Elena looked at her reflection in the window. "Good," she said. The plane began to move. Washington was 2 hours ahead, 6 days before a review that was going to put her name, or the shape of her name, the service number that stood in for it, in front of a board that was going to push on every gap in her record and some things that weren't gaps at all. She opened her notebook. She started reviewing the statement she'd memorized the night before, going through it the same way she went through a firing solution, methodically, checking each component against the next, looking for the places where the calculation might drift and the shot might miss. There weren't many, but the one that remained was Dowell, and what he was going to do when he found out she was in the room. She turned the page and wrote his name at the top and began mapping the problem the same way she'd mapped the Harker Valley. Terrain features, wind indicators, the places where the shot became unpredictable. The plane lifted off the runway and the mountains dropped away beneath her, and somewhere behind her Nathan Reed drank his coffee and said nothing, and the distance to Washington measured itself in the specific currency of decisions that were already made and couldn't be unmade, which was fine. She'd made the decision with her eyes open. She always did. Washington in February was a different kind of cold than the mountains. The mountains were honest about it. The cold came at you directly, wind and elevation, and the physics of altitude doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Washington's cold was ambient and institutional, the kind that lived in marble corridors and conference rooms where the heating worked perfectly and still something about the air never quite warmed up. Elena felt it the moment she walked into the building. The Joint Special Operations Oversight Board met in a facility that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable government annex. The kind of building that existed in clusters of similar buildings in the Virginia suburbs, distinguished from its neighbors only by the specific quality of the vehicles in the parking structure and the number of security checkpoints between the street and the elevators. Inside, the corridors were wide and carpeted and lit with the flat fluorescent efficiency of places that processed important decisions without wanting the importance to be visible in the architecture. Vance met her and Nathan at the security desk. He looked like he'd slept maybe 4 hours, which Elena assessed from the specific quality of his composure, the way it was working slightly harder than it needed to if he'd been rested. He shook her hand in Nathan's and walked them through the second checkpoint without preamble. "Pre-briefing with Callaway is at 0900, he said, moving them down the corridor at a pace that said the schedule was tight. "Board chair. He wants 30 minutes with both of you before the formal session. He's going to be direct and he's going to ask things that feel adversarial. He's not being adversarial. He's testing whether you hold up under questioning so he knows what he's working with before you're in the room with everyone else." "Who else is in the formal session?" Elena said. 7 board members. 4 of them have been briefed on the working group proposal at the working level. 3 haven't. Of the 3 who haven't, 2 of them have had informal conversations with Dowell in the past 60 days. He paused at a corner. Dowell himself is not on the board. He's not in the building today. The competing proposal was submitted in writing 2 weeks ago and is part of the formal record. He knows about the IG referral, Elena said. It wasn't a question. Vance's expression confirmed it wasn't one. He was informed yesterday afternoon, Vance said. Standard notification process when a referral involves a flag officer's administrative record. He pushed open a door, which is why this morning's session matters. The room Calloway was waiting in was small. A conference table that seated 6, no windows, a single projection screen on the far wall showing nothing. Calloway was already seated, a legal pad in front of him, a pen he'd clearly been using, a coffee mug that was empty and had been empty long enough to leave a ring on the table. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, with the specific physical quality of someone who had once been very fit and had transitioned into the kind of fitness that was about maintenance rather than performance. His face was the kind of face that had spent decades making decisions and had learned not to show the cost of them in real time. He looked at Elena when she came in and held the look for a moment, the specific evaluative look of someone cataloging information. And then he stood and shook her hand. "Captain Cross." His voice was measured. "Sit down. We don't have much time." They sat. Vance took the chair to Elena's left, Nathan to her right, Calloway across. "I've read your written statement," Calloway said. He tapped the legal pad, which she could see had notes on it in small, dense handwriting. "I have questions, and I want you to answer them the way you'd answer them in the formal session. Meaning, if the answer is classified above what you can say in this room, tell me that rather than saying something incomplete." "Understood?" Elena said. "The statement references a 71-hour engagement in a denied access environment. It doesn't name the operation, the location, or the unit supported." "Correct." "The board is going to push on those gaps. I can manage the question about the unit. Commander Reed's testimony covers that. The location and operation designation are going to be harder." He looked at her steadily. "Is there a pathway to declassifying even a partial operational designation for the purposes of this board?" "I've requested it," Elena said. "The response I received was that the request is under review, which means no, for the purposes of this morning." Calloway made a note. "The statement also references the program's operational effectiveness through outcome metrics. Number of engagements, supported units, mission success rates, but the specific numbers are redacted." "Yes. The redacted figures are available through the classified annex that Vance submitted to the board under separate cover?" "The figures available through that annex are the ones I'm authorized to reference," Elena said. "They're accurate, and they're verifiable through the program's own records, which the board can request access to through appropriate channels." Calloway looked at his notes. "The 2 board members who've been in contact with General Dowell are named Hargrove and Price. I'm telling you this because you should know it going in." He looked up. "Hargrove is going to challenge the credibility of anonymous testimony. Price is going to challenge the program structure argument on efficiency grounds. Both of those are legitimate challenges, and the board process allows them." He paused. "They may also challenge things that are not legitimate. If that happens, I'll manage it. Your job is to answer the questions you can answer and clearly state when you've reached the boundary of what you can answer. Don't speculate past your authorization. Don't fill gaps with inference in a formal session." "Yes, I understand," Elena said. Calloway looked at her for another moment. "You've been running a sniper section for 14 months, he said. "Before that, your record has a gap of approximately 4 years, during which you are listed as attached to a training and advisory unit at a location that, when I checked, doesn't correspond to any unit I can find in the formal order of battle." He paused. "Before that, you were in a special operations support role that is partially classified." He set down the pen. "What I'm telling you is that your record, as I read it, is the record of someone who has been doing something that the record isn't describing. And I'm asking you here, before we go into that room, whether the statement you've written is the truth." "Amantam ichi suchasin." Elena looked at Calloway. "Yes," she said. "The complete truth within your authorization constraints." "Yes." He held her gaze for 5 seconds. Then he picked up the pen. "All right," he said, "let's go over the structure of the formal session." The formal session began at 1000 in a larger room down the corridor. A proper hearing configuration, 7 board members at a curved table elevated slightly above the witness position, a stenographer in the corner, a recording system that the board's administrative officer explained before they began. Vance sat to Elena's left at the witness table. Nathan sat to her right. The 7 board members were a range of ages and service backgrounds that told you, If you read it carefully, something about the institutional history of special operations oversight over the past 2 decades. Calloway sat at the center. 2 positions to his left, a woman named General Hargrove, retired 2-star, Army, with the kind of composed authority that came from a career spent in rooms where composure was mandatory. 3 positions to Calloway's right, a man named Price, civilian, former Defense Department senior executive, with the look of someone who understood organizational structure the way mechanics understood engines. Calloway opened the session with procedural formalities that took 4 minutes, and then he turned to the witness table. "Captain Cross," he said, "you've submitted a written statement, which the board has reviewed. I'd like to begin with your operational background. In your own words, not from the statement, tell us what you did." Elena had thought about this part specifically, how to compress years into minutes without losing the things that mattered for this argument. "I was recruited into a special operations support program approximately 8 years ago," she said. "The program's mission was to provide precision fire support and intelligence collection capability in operational environments where conventional military presence was not viable. I operated as a singleton, without a dedicated support team, in contested environments at extended ranges." She paused. The work required the ability to function independently for extended periods under conditions that were not controlled and often not predicted accurately by pre-mission intelligence. "How many operational deployments?" Calloway said. 11. Duration range. Shortest was 6 days. Longest was 71 hours of active engagement preceded by 9 days of pre-positioning. "The engagement referenced in your statement?" "Yes." Hargrove leaned forward. Her voice was measured and not unfriendly, which was its own kind of pressure. "Captain Cross, the board appreciates your willingness to testify. I want to ask about the structural argument in your statement directly." She looked at the papers in front of her. "You argue that the program's termination was the result of a structural vulnerability in its oversight model, specifically that a single-layer oversight mechanism allowed administrative interference at a level that wouldn't have been possible under a multi-layer structure." She looked up. "That's a policy argument. What I'd like to understand is whether you have direct knowledge of the interference you're describing or whether that's inference from the timeline." "Direct knowledge," Elena said. A small shift in the room. "Can you characterize the nature of that knowledge?" "I can characterize it as documentary. I reviewed administrative records that establish a timeline between a denied operational request and the initiation of the program review that led to termination." She paused. "Those records have been submitted to the Inspector General through a separate formal process." "You're referencing the referral filed 4 days ago," Calloway said. "Yes." Hargrove looked at Calloway. Something passed between them that was too fast to read. Price spoke for the first time. He had the voice of someone who had spent decades in meetings, assured, organized, not aggressive, but not gentle either. "The efficiency argument for centralized command structure is well established," he said. "The competing proposal before this board makes a reasonable case that multi-layer oversight slows decision cycles in time-sensitive operational environments. How does your statement address that?" "The statement addresses it directly on page 7, Elena said. "Decision cycle speed is a relevant consideration. It's not the only relevant consideration. The program I operated in made time-sensitive decisions at the operational level without requiring board approval for individual missions. The oversight structure governed program parameters, not individual engagements. A well-designed multi-layer structure preserves operational tempo while preventing the parameter drift that occurred in the original program." "Parameter drift," Price said. "The use of program assets for purposes outside the authorized operational envelope." "Can you give the board an example of the kind of parameter drift you're describing?" The room was very quiet. Elena looked at Price steadily. "The IG referral contains specific examples," she said. "I'm not going to characterize them orally in this session before that process has concluded, because doing so would be outside the appropriate procedural sequence." Price looked at her. She held the look. "That's a reasonable position," Calloway said smoothly, in a way that closed that line of questioning. Nathan testified for 40 minutes after Elena. He was precise and direct and described the Korova province contact in operational terms, that were specific enough to be credible and general enough to stay within his authorization. He described what the supporting fire had meant for the mission outcome. He described in terms that were professional and controlled and showed the edges of something he was keeping controlled with visible effort, what it meant to bring 12 people home from a situation where the rational calculation had been that you weren't going to. The board listened without interruption. When Nathan finished, Calloway called a 30-minute recess. In the corridor, Vance found Elena at the water fountain at the end of the hall and stood beside her. "Hargrove is going to recommend in favor of the working group proposal," he said quietly. I can see it in her questioning pattern. She asked about direct knowledge because she needed to know if the IG referral was solid before she committed. And price? Price is going to be harder. He looked at the closed door of the hearing room. He's not in Dowell's pocket. He genuinely believes in efficiency arguments. The question is whether the structural case is strong enough to overcome that. What do we need from the remaining board members? 4 votes minimum to pass the recommendation. We have 3 who are already oriented toward the working group proposal. Calloway controls his own vote and will vote for the stronger structural argument, which means we need either Hargrove or Price, plus one of the 3 undecideds. He paused. Before today, I thought Hargrove was the uncertain one. Now I think it's Price. Elena stood with the water for a moment. What does Price actually need? She said. He needs to believe the structure works as described, not the policy argument. He understands policy. He needs to believe the operational reality matches the theoretical model. Vance looked at her. He's an engineer type. He trusts things that have been tested. Then he needs to hear from someone who tested it, Elena said. Vance looked at her. You've given your testimony. I gave my authorized testimony. She handed him the water cup. There are things in the operational record that I can speak to directly in a closed session that I can't say in the open record. If Calloway calls a closed session for the final portion, I can address Price's question specifically. Vance was quiet for a moment. That's not a small ask for you. I know. Some of what you'd be describing. I know what I'd be describing, she said. I was there. He looked at her for another second. Then he nodded and went to find Calloway. What? The closed session ran 90 minutes. Elena testified in a room with the 7 board members, a classification officer, a single stenographer operating under specific security protocols, and no one else. Vance and Nathan waited in the corridor. She answered questions she hadn't been able to answer in the open session. She described specific operational contexts, not target names, not partner identities, but the texture of the work. What it meant to make time-sensitive decisions without a command structure available. What the oversight model had looked like from inside the operational environment and why it had functioned as designed until it didn't. What the failure of that oversight looked like from the same vantage point. She described the moment she'd understood the program was ending. A conversation with Garrett that had been brief and specific. The way conversations about bad news are when the people having them are professionals, and the bad news is final. The way she'd driven back to a temporary residence from that conversation and sat in a parking lot for 40 minutes doing something she still didn't have a good word for, before she'd started the car and made the decisions that had produced the 14 months at Dellard City. Price asked her 3 questions in that session that he hadn't asked in the open one. He asked them carefully, the way careful people ask things they actually need the answers to, and she answered them with the same specificity she'd applied to the firing solution on Icefang. Not more than what was needed, not less. When she was done, Price sat back in his chair and looked at his notepad for a long moment. Then he looked up. The structural model in the working group proposal, he said. You believe it would have prevented the interference you described. I believe it would have made it significantly harder, she said. Not impossible. Nothing is impossible given sufficient motivation and time. But the mechanism that was used, the administrative review channel, requires a single point of authority to initiate. 3-layer oversight with separate command authorities means that mechanism doesn't work because no single authority can initiate unilaterally. Price nodded once, slowly. Thank you, Captain, he said. The board's formal deliberation lasted 2 hours. Elena and Nathan and Vance waited in a small room with bad coffee and a view of the parking structure. Nobody talked much. Nathan read something on his phone. Vance sat with a legal pad and wrote things that he periodically crossed out. Elena sat with her notebook open and did nothing with it. At 15:47, the administrative officer came to the door. "The board is ready," he said. They walked back. The 7 board members were seated. Their faces showed the specific flat professionalism of people who had completed a decision and were in the process of delivering it. Calloway spoke. "The board has reviewed the working group's proposal, the competing proposal, and the testimony and documentary evidence submitted in today's session." His voice was even and unhurried. "The board finds the structural argument in the working group proposal to be substantiated by the operational record and testimony presented, and recommends its adoption as the framework for reconstitution of the program." He paused. "The board further notes that certain administrative actions referenced in today's testimony and in a concurrent IG referral warrant formal review before any program reconstitution proceeds, and recommends that reconstitution be held pending the outcome of that review." He looked up from this paper. "The vote was 5-2 in favor," he said. Elena looked at the table in front of her. 5-2. She did the math automatically. Calloway, Hargrove, Price, and 2 of the 3 undecideds. Price had moved. Calloway set the paper down. He looked at Elena directly. "The board would like to formally acknowledge the testimony provided today," he said. "The operational record documented in the classified annex and in the closed session represents a standard of service that this board considers significant." He paused. "On behalf of the board, Captain Cross, thank you." The room was quiet. Elena nodded once. That was all she had in that moment. Just the one nod, and the specific quality of stillness that came after a long calculation finally resolved. The IG investigation moved with the particular speed of institutional processes that had been handed specific, well-documented evidence and a political context that made delay inadvisable. Vance told her 3 weeks later over the phone that Dowell had been placed on administrative hold pending the outcome, which meant he was not in the building, not making decisions, not working the board relationships that had sustained his competing proposal. The proposal itself had been withdrawn from consideration by the board's administrative process when the IG review began because the procedural rules didn't allow a proposal to advance while its primary proponent was under formal investigation. 4 weeks after that, Garrett called her. He called her actual phone with his actual number, which was the first time he'd ever done that. The IG referred to the Department of Justice. He said, "Timeline? Unknown. Could be a year. Could be more." He paused. "But he's done. Regardless of what justice does, his career is over. The administrative hold becomes permanent at the 90-day mark if the investigation is still open, and the investigation will be open." Elena was in her apartment in Dellard City, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd started the written statement. The plaque from the Harker Invitational was on the shelf above the counter, next to a water bottle and a charging cable, and the general domestic accumulation of a life that was organized around function rather than display. "And the program?" she said. "Vance is working this reconstitution timeline. The board wants to see the IG process advance before they move. Realistically, 6 months before anything formal, possibly longer." A pause. "They're going to want to talk to you about the operational structure when it's time." "I know." "You could say no." "I know that too," she said. A pause. "I miss Halloran," Garrett said. He said it the way people say things they don't say very often, carefully, like they're checking the weight of it. "Yeah," Elena said. "Me too." They stayed on the line for a moment without talking. "Take care of yourself," Garrett said. "You too." She hung up. Outside her window, Dellard City was doing what it did on a Tuesday in March. Traffic, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the sound of the building's heating system cycling on. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary place. She'd chosen it specifically because it was ordinary, and for 14 months that had been exactly the right choice. She wasn't sure it was still the right choice. She wasn't sure it wasn't either. She let that sit. Donahue called her back to his office 2 days after she returned from Washington. He'd received the official notification that her temporary assignment had concluded. He'd read whatever the notification said, which she knew was general in the way official notifications were general. He'd sat with it for 48 hours before calling her in. She stood at the modified rest position, and he looked at her from his desk. You can stand easy, he said. This isn't that kind of conversation. She stood easy. The assignment concluded, he said. Yes, sir. It apparently went well. Adequately, sir. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I'm not going to ask you what it was. He looked at the desk for a moment. What I'm going to ask is whether you're planning to stay. Elena looked at him. I'm asking because a joint task force directorate reached out informally yesterday, he said. Not through official channels, through a mutual contact who I served with 15 years ago. He met her eyes. They're interested in you for an advisory and training role. The parameters they described were vague in a way that suggests the actual parameters are not vague at all, just classified. He paused. It would be a reassignment, out of my section. What do you think I should do? She said. He blinked. It was clearly not the question he'd expected. That's the first time you've asked me that in 14 months, he said. Yes, sir. He sat back. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression he got when he was thinking rather than managing. I think, he said carefully, that some people are suited to a specific kind of work that doesn't stay available forever. And I think that when the window for that work is open, it's worth walking through it. He paused. I also think you're the best shot I've ever supervised, which means I'm personally motivated to keep you, and I'm trying to account for that bias. Elena almost smiled. She didn't, quite. I appreciate the transparency, sir. Will you take it? She thought about Kurova Province. She thought about Halloran at 38. She thought about Vance's working group and a reconstitution timeline of 6 months, and a classification officer in a hearing room, and Price asking her 3 questions that he actually needed answered. She thought about the range at Harker, and a 7th target at 2 kilometers and change, and a valley that was doing everything it could to make the shot impossible. She'd made the shot anyway. Yes, she said. I'll take it. Donahue nodded. Something in him settled. Not disappointment, she thought. More like resolution. The feeling of a problem that has found its correct answer. I'll facilitate the paperwork, he said. Cross. He stopped her at the door. For what it's worth, and I know it's not much, given I don't have full context, whatever you did in that room in Washington, it mattered. She looked at him. How do you know? She said. Because the kind of people who called me from joint task force directorates don't do it for people who show up and answer questions, he said. They do it for people who change something. He paused. You changed something. She stood there for a moment. Thank you, sir, she said. She meant it. Nathan called her the evening before she left Dellard City. She was half-packed, the apartment in that specific transitional state of somewhere between inhabited and vacated, boxes stacked along the living room wall, the kitchen down to the essentials. She answered on the second ring. Heard you're moving, he said. Word travels. Vance told me. He tells me things. A pause. The advisory role? Is it what you want? She thought about the question honestly. I don't know yet. It's what makes sense. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. Elena. He said her name directly, which he'd only done a handful of times. What you did in that hearing, the closed session, the IG documentation, all of it. Vance told me what it cost you to do that, what it meant for the life you'd built here. It needed doing, she said. I know I'm not... He stopped, started again. I've been carrying the debt from Kurova Province for 7 years. I want to be honest about the fact that I came to that staging area and found you and said the thing I said partly because I needed to put the debt down, and the effect of that on your life was not my primary consideration in that moment. A pause. It should have been more of my consideration than it was. She leaned against the kitchen counter. Read. Yeah. 12 people went home, she said. That's the only calculation that matters. It's not the only one. It's the one I'm working with. A silence. Victor wants your number, Nathan said. He wants to say thank you directly. I told him I'd ask. She looked at the plaque on the shelf, which she'd decided was going in a box rather than a garbage bag, which was itself a decision she hadn't been sure about until just now. Tell him yes, she said. Okay. A pause. Take care of yourself. People keep telling me that. Maybe that means something. She made a sound that was the closest she'd come to a laugh in a while. Maybe. She hung up. She stood in the half-empty kitchen for a moment, in the specific quiet of a place that was already releasing its hold on you, and let herself feel the full weight of the last 6 weeks without managing it. The hearing room. Calloway's face when she finished the closed session. The 2-hour wait and the 5-2 vote and the single nod that was all she'd had left to give. Halloran at 38, 12 men going home. A 7th target at 2 kilometers and change, dead center, in conditions that most people said made the shot impossible. She'd made the shot. She packed the plaque carefully, wrapped in a sweatshirt, placed at the top of the last box where it wouldn't get damaged. In the morning, she loaded the Tacoma. She drove south out of Dellard City with the mountains in the rearview mirror and the windows cracked just enough for the cold air to come through. And somewhere outside the city limits, she turned the radio on for the first time in the entire drive from Harker and found something that wasn't news and wasn't commentary and let it run. She drove. The mountains dropped behind her and the country opened up, and the road ahead was long and clear and specific in the way that roads are specific when you know where you're going and you've made peace with what it took to get there. She had scars from Korova province that the cold still found on bad days. She had a classified record full of gaps that looked, to people who knew how to read them, like the shape of something significant. She had a plaque in a box in her truck bed and a phone number from a naval commander and a contact in the IG's office, and a conversation with a program director scheduled for 6 months from now. She was 34 years old. She had work to do. The road ran straight and long into the distance, and she drove it at a steady pace, no faster than necessary, and no slower than the moment required. The most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who has spent years becoming quietly extraordinary. Not because it's unfair to them, though it is, but because in the moment that actually matters, you will be entirely unprepared for what they are capable of. Elena Cross didn't need anyone to see her. She needed to be ready. There is a difference, and it is the whole lesson.